Trump to cut military spending in half. Hi everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insight, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, welcome back Sam, who's been looking at some quite extraordinary claims that we're getting from President Trump, saying, let's just cut our spending. If everyone does that, we don't need all this spending on military. Certainly very interesting thought, and the impacts of that it would have on the debt and the ongoing spending. How are you going today, Sam?
Chris, yeah, there's no shortage of stuff to talk about from a day-to-day basis.
There certainly isn't. And this one is really interesting to me because it seems like one of those ideas that in some ways is too good to be true, that you would go, well, if everyone just cuts their spending, then we just save a whole lot of money. It makes sense. I mean, there's flow-on consequences of that money being spent, where that actually goes. And there's lots of things to talk about there. But I suppose my first question is, what are they actually talking about here? And is it even possible in your mind?
That's the big thing that people have been wondering for ages. Is it possible to cut military spending? Because since we got our warning about the military-industrial complex, it's just been an ongoing issue. You know, Vietnam was kind of the first war where people thought, oh, it's just like World War II, we're going to save the day, and just kind of turned out being a mess, and then kept getting worse from there. So it's become almost, it seems like de facto against the rules to say, I'm going to cut military spending. You never cut, you just increase. And Trump has been extremely close with the military. If you remember his last administration, every picture was him surrounded by generals. So if he actually does manage to cut the military spending, and not even by 5% or 10%, but 50% is what he's saying, that would be potentially a massive win. I just guess it depends where the money goes. Is it going to be, kept in the form of tax cuts? Is it going to be rerouted to somewhere else in the economy? I guess that would be the big second question after, is it possible?
And that's a really good point and a really good angle to go down, because the reallocation of that money would certainly need to happen at some level of scale. I mean, the military, just as an employer, is a very large employer right around the world, but particularly in the United States. So you would imagine that that's a lot of jobs that are going. Obviously, they're talking about cutting a lot of federal jobs anyway, but I would argue this is quite different when you're talking about military positions. Does that get redirected into other front-facing services on the ground, perhaps? I don't know. Do you have any sort of thoughts about how you would even approach that?
Well, I guess it would be a very, very noble assumption to assume that even 50% of the money the military gets goes to paychecks, which, people are taking home and spending on their families. It's, there's very expensive equipment. There's very overpriced equipment. There are stories that come out all the time. Some of them get a thumbs up, some of them get a thumbs down of, we're going to make this new unmanned boat. It's only going to cost, $10 billion per unit or something, and might be redundant in a couple of years. So these are sort of things that they could potentially cut back on. I'm sure it wouldn't just be firing half the military. It might be going after some of these big contracts, which are, there have been movies made about it. People essentially taking advantage of the U.S. military budget and spending way too much taxpayer money and not really getting a benefit. And then you look at other militaries which could almost go toe to toe with the U.S. military potentially, and they're not spending. They're spending a fraction of what the U.S. is spending. So. That being said, Trump also said his first talks about this will be with China and Russia to try to get them to reduce spending as well. Since a nuclear war in the capacity that we could do it would just be, the world is over, for humans at least. So.
And I wonder, because you addressed this a little bit when you were writing about it in the article, whether that sort of waste that's been there in that system hasn't really resulted in defence funds really being that inflationary, because they're probably funneled into the hands of a few and not really hitting the mainstream economy potentially. I don't really know how I can think about that one, but I could imagine that if we are redirecting some of those funds, that there could potentially be a broader redistribution of that money. Do you think that could have flow-on consequences for things like inflation? Because I'm still worried about that with the tariff argument and the tariff discussion, that people are very quick to say, oh, well, it's offset through productivity increases or the production that's happening in the US. But still, in the short term, all of these things to me seem like they could be quite inflationary.
Yes. So the major thing there is the velocity of money. And that's one thing that some people don't realize is it's not how much of something there is, it's where it goes. So if I took a million tons of toxic nuclear waste and I buried it underground in the desert, or I launched it into space, well, it may as well not exist at all, right? But if I took 1 liter of nuclear toxic waste and put it in someone's cup of coffee, well, that wouldn't be very nice as a result. So it matters where you actually, not just how much of something, but where you put it. If we're printing trillions and trillions of dollars and giving it to industries that essentially just reinvest the money, or the money's really concentrated in a specific spot, that's where these major tax breaks to big companies or these really low interest rates like we saw during COVID didn't cause a huge amount of inflation right away, because if a Wall Street business has, an extra couple $2 billion, well, they're just going to kind of sit on it. Whereas if you look at if that money's distributed to people who are trying to pay their rent and have some food and things like that, well, they're going to go and get their car fixed. They're going to go stock up on groceries. They're going to go do a lot more high velocity stuff that's going to get the money washing around the system instead of just buried in a vault somewhere with someone sitting on it. And I guess if you look at some of these major military contracts that happen, the beneficiaries of those are probably more sitting on money and reinvesting it than going and buying some groceries. After this announcement was made, you could see Northrop Grumman, which is a huge weapons maker, they dropped, since its announcement, the last few days, they've dropped about 7%, their share value. So if this was rerouted, let's say in the form of tax cuts, I would speculate that the velocity of money on this would increase heavily. We'd probably see some inflation as well. But then the other thing is, if people are paying debt on money and they're not getting any of that money, well, that's not very useful. But if people are getting that money in the form of a tax cut, or they're getting that money in the form of something they can use to spend, it's not as concerning that they owe debt on that money, because at least they're getting a piece of the action.
That explanation makes a whole lot of sense. I think you've pulled together a lot of key misconceptions that I would have there as well about how it actually works, because it really is about that velocity, as you've described, and where the money lands matters. So I suppose that leads me to my final question. How does that potentially flow through into the gold market? Because you would expect some of that money potentially lands in the gold market. But then it's a tricky question, because if we effectively are cutting military spending in the major players in the world there, I mean, if you're talking about, China, Russia, and the US cutting military spending, that you would think on the surface at least makes the world a somewhat, in quotes, safer place.
Yes,
does that
hopefully
then impact what happens with gold when you think of it as that safe haven, particularly the geopolitical safe haven aspect of that? So, I don't know how to think about that. Do you have more money flowing, that velocity you were talking about, into the market that pushes the inflation buttons and makes gold really attractive there as a defensive play against that inflation, offsetting potentially some of its geopolitical maneuvering that's been happening recently?
So to summarize that, so on one side, we're looking at a reason to buy gold being global catastrophe, world war, something like that. And then the other side, you're putting inflation. Well, this story moves the needle towards the inflation being the reason to buy gold. And for me, that's a very satisfying move of the needle, because I wouldn't want to be, dragged into a war or see global chaos. I think a bit of inflation is a lot more manageable than some global catastrophe where weapons makers come out on top. I guess people who buy gold come out on top, but at a heavy price. Whereas, the inflation side of things, if money's being redistributed and things are being recalibrated, who knows? It could keep going in that direction. Of course, we're seeing a lot of moves in audits happening. So inflation inflation could potentially be hopefully fixed in some regards.
Man, it will be very interesting to see one of those audits in particular. We'll all be paying attention to see if all that gold is sitting where it's supposed to be sitting in Fort Knox, of course. But absolutely fascinating discussion, as always, Sam. And like you say, every week we seem to have a different angle we can approach this from. So this is quite a positive one, how you've ended that, I think, to say, really, it would be a good thing overall. I'm sure we can all agree on that, to have a safer world with a lot less military spending, if that can be pulled off. Big if, but it's an interesting one for sure. So thank you for your work on that.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.